let's talk about the geographic spread of um, the madhab. So the madhab was concentrated in Baghdad for obvious reasons. Okay, the madhab was concentrated in Baghdad for obvious reasons, and that's because that was where Imam Ahmed was. Um, it was the area that most of his companions were, and they spread out to Syria, they spread down to Egypt, they spread here to the Arabian Peninsula, so the center of Saudi Arabia, or the Arabian Peninsula at that time, like Qasim and Najd, although they weren't as prominent in Najd as they were until later. In fact, many of the ulama of al-Kharj, other places, were Hanafis. The ulama of the eastern provinces were Malikis, and the Hanabila were spread here because of the connection of the tribes that spread down from Iraq into Central Arabia, and then you had some Hanabila, of course, in the Hijaz, in Mecca especially. You also had them in Basra. Now, the question is a very interesting question, is, well, what about al-Maghrib al-Arabi? What about Transoxania, Ma Wara al-Nahr? So, what about the areas beyond the Oxus River? And the areas of Bukhara and Samarkand and all of these areas. Were there Hanabila there? Yes, there were, but they were very, very few. Were there Hanabila in al-Maghrib? I don't believe so. However, the books of the Hanabila certainly reached to those areas, and we find people throughout history who would come to the east to learn from the Hanabila. But you'll find, some of the books of the Hanabila referenced in the books of the Malikiya in al-Maghrib. What about beyond that? What about nowadays? Where's the spread of the madhab? Well, the madhab has spread actually far and wide now, and that is for the virtue of several things. Number one is the virtue of al-Jami' Islami ibn Medina Munawwara, my alma mater, because of our study of the madhab amongst the other three madhahib. When I was a student there, we studied al-fiqh al-muqaran, we studied comparative fiqh, and outside, each student was encouraged to study a madhab and really dedicate themselves to that. So some students would study the Shafi'i school. Some would come to al-Medina having already finished madhab studies in their countries, whereas we who had not would simply find the most available durus and study there. And because many of the ulama of the Mamlaka were Hanabila, that became the easiest thing to study. And therefore, when students went back to their home countries, they started to study, or they started to teach the madhab as well. In addition to the accessibility of the books of the Hanabila, the use of textual dalil, textual evidence in the books of the Hanabila. You'll now find, Hanabila teaching in Bangladesh. You'll find Hanabila here in the U.S. Inshallah, one of our brothers went to Tijuana and found a brother giving durus. I believe it was from Akhsar al-Mukhtasarat. So the madhab has spread far and wide. So I joke with the brothers, and I say that if there were Hanabila fi ma wara al-Nahr, then we would be Hanabila fi wara al-Bahr. We would be the Hanabila that are beyond the ocean instead of beyond the river. The important thing about the study of the madhab is not to be muta'assib, is not to be a blind follower. And what that means is that it doesn't mean you pick and choose from the madhab what you want. It means that you don't take the madhab as some kind of thing that it becomes a reason for wala and bara upon. You don't use the study of a legal system to become a reason for denigrating and hating and causing rifts between Muslims. And I think that as a tarbawi kind of pedagogical approach, that it's very one thing to read is the Masail of al-Kawsaj, because you have Ahmed and Ishaq, both imams of fiqh and hadith, being read to them the questions and answers that were given to Sufyan, also an imam of fiqh and hadith, and then at many times disagreeing with each other, sitting right there in front of each other. And the way that they handled that disagreement was not to chastise each other and talk about who is right and who's wrong, but to simply disagree and say, this is what I based it on. So my point is that if you're going to study a madhab and you find that all you're doing is arguing with others and who's better, my imam's better, then you probably are just replacing something you used to do with this now. So if you were like a sports fan and you always had to have a team to support, then you might be a person who's engaging in those same kind of attitudes or same types of things with things based in Islam. And I tell brothers this all the time. A lot of times, you don't need a sheikh and a madhab, right? You don't need a murshid and a tariqah, right? You don't need an alim and a manhaj. A lot of times, some of you really just need a hobby and a friend. You should not be making ilm your hobby. Ilm, the reason behind ilm, Imam Ahmad rahmatullah alayhi, he was asked, هل يجوز للإنسان أن ينوي أن يكون عالما? Is it permissible for a person to intend to become a scholar? He said, نعم إذا نوى رفع الجهل عن نفسه وعن غيره. He said, yes, if a person intends to remove ignorance from themselves and from others. So how can your study of any madhab, whether it's the Hanbali madhab or the Shafi'i madhab or the Maliki madhab or the Hanafi madhab or the even in other madhab that are generally not found in any way, shape, or form nowadays, but let's just put it out there. How can your study of these madhab, if the idea is to remove ignorance from yourself and others, make you more ignorant, make you more belligerent, make you more spiteful, make you more rude? It's a contradiction in term, and it's an offense to the sacred knowledge of the Quran, the Sunnah, the transmitted knowledge of these madhahib, and to the A'immah that taught us. Okay, so here's the we talked about the kind of the spread, geographical spread of I smile because that reminds me of something a classmate told me one time. But anyway, with this spread, why didn't Ahmed's school spread farther? And one of the reasons for that is that Ahmed's position on assuming official offices was one that was very stringent. He himself would not take a stipend. He himself would not assume official positions with the governments of his time. He was very, very adamant about not doing this. And, he was very particular. And I believe it was his son Saleh who, rahimahullah ta'ala, who essentially had a family and needed to make money, who eventually did take a position. He was unhappy with that. But the general aversion to taking official position meant that a person would not be in a situation where they were a mufti or a qadi or a mustashar or anything else, and therefore they would not have the kind of time and leisure that came with having a steady salary, and thus they would not have the effect that they had. So you can imagine that if you're giving fatwa in an area and people are saying, well, what did the mufti say? And it's all of your fatwa, people are going to follow that. Or if you are the qadi and you're saying, apply this ruling, people are going to apply that. It's one of the reasons why the Hanafi school spread the way that it did, is because al-qadi Abu Yusuf was a qadi. He was a judge, right? And so he and other of the early Ahnaf took those positions, right? And so there are benefits and positive and negatives that come from each. So the ability to gain position in fatwa and qada was influenced or did influence which schools would be studied. So if you found most of the muftin, most of the qudat of your area were being appointed from the Hanafi school, and you had not studied the Hanafi school, then it was less likely that you're going to go and redo everything and take a position. It would also mean that if you wanted a position, you would start off with the intention of doing that school rather than a school where there was kind of a general aversion to it. The idea that Ahmed's madhab was less prominent because it was preceded by other madhahib is not strong, in that Ahmed's madhab has outlived many other very influential and very prominent madhahib, like the madhab of al-Awza'i, the madhab of al-Layth, the madhab of Sufyan, the madhab of al-Tabari. And so these were all preceding him or along, consecutive to him, and yet his madhab preceded, or his madhab succeeded them. So why is that? Well, I think it's because of two reasons. Number one is because during the Seljuk and the Mamluk codifications of Sunni Islam underneath their rule, they codified the four madhahib as being the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali schools, and they established official schools for them. And in fact, if you go to the Masjid of Sultan Hassan in Cairo, you can take a picture of Madrasatul Hanabila there at the masjid. And so that's one reason, is that in that late period there was official support for it as an official madhab. And there's a number of very, very interesting kind of political things that have to do with that, in like the struggles with the Safavids and all of that. We won't go into that. Another reason is that the madhab of the Hanabila is I believe what's a word that I can use? I believe the madhab of the Hanabila is the treasure chest, or the steam trunk of opinions not found in the other three madhab. What do I mean by that? The Hanbali madhab has a very large number of issues called al-mufradat, singular opinions that were between the four madhab, only held by Ahmed. And there are a number of different writings on this book, al-Minah al-Shafiyat, that explain them, and others. But the value of that is that Ahmed was essentially transmitting to people opinions that were transmitted to him, and so there is a large amount of fiqh salaf that is preserved in the madhab al-Hanbali, and that is extremely valuable in the study of fiqh. How do we know it's valuable? Because we find the scholars who are muhaqqiqeen. You'll find Nawawi, Ibn Hajar, Zayla'i. You'll find all of these later scholars, Ibn Abidin and others, right? That they'll reference. Well, there's this opinion in the Hanbali school. Sometimes they'll take that, sometimes they won't. But the point is that there's a principle of mass preservation of earlier generations in the Hanbali school, which I think was very, very crucial.